All right, welcome back, everybody. Moving on in our agenda, we are at the Planning and Development Department, 9.2.1, Municipal-Wide Planning, our drinking water protection. And I want to thank those who are joining us for this discussion as part of our municipal-wide planning. And we have made an adjustment in our agenda to allow an additional public input session following the presentation in case there are comments or concerns that you want to bring forward to council after hearing the presentation. I'll turn it over to staff to lead us in this discussion. Reed and Ella.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if we could maybe just switch on the inputs, and I'll throw a presentation on the screen here. Yeah, thank you very much. So today, Ella and I are here to provide some information regarding the protection of drinking water as one topic within the municipal-wide land use planning. The intention being to provide information that the committee can discuss. We're here to answer questions, and we can also speak to some of the different options and different things that are out there and try to focus a little bit more specifically on this topic especially. And I know there are other topics kind of forthcoming in future policy and strategy committee meetings. And so I think this will be a good opportunity if there's things that you're looking for in terms of next ones where there's different types of information or the format and things like that, that feedback would be helpful as well, of course, because this is just the first of several different discussions. So what we'll focus largely on today is just an overview of this topic area, and then outline some of the watershed areas that pertain to drinking water in our municipality. And we will also outline what some of the approaches were in the first draft, just so council has an understanding of what's in that document, because there's different pieces that come together, and it's sometimes hard to see how those different tools and approaches look when they're put together. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but it is helpful to see those put together in a certain type of regulation. So I guess first what we'll touch on is understanding what a watershed is. And I realized there was just some discussion about watersheds and uranium mining earlier this morning. But when it comes to drinking water, there are some specifics that pertain especially to our municipality. I guess one key piece to clarify as well is that when we're talking here about protection of watersheds, we're talking about the protection of municipal water supplies. This is not touching on individual homeowners' wells, which are absolutely an important piece to consider, in which planning regulations can play a role. But when it comes to what the province requires and what this is focused on, it's those, largely town water supplies. So when we're talking about Bridgewater, Lunenburg, Mahone Bay, and of course this area is part of that the town of Bridgewater's supply. It's that municipal water supply, and where that water comes from is what this is focused on. So basically a watershed is basically all of those points in the landscape which drain into one specific area. So you could look at the LaHave River, you could look at Petite Riviere, Martins River, there are and then different lakes within those. There's a defined watershed boundary at which point all of the water flows down to that lowest point, and you reach a certain point and the water starts flowing in a different direction. So you're looking at these areas in terms of all of the water from a certain point flowing into that collection point. And in our case, all of the water sources for the towns is drawn from surface water, and that means lakes within our municipality. And so they're drawing water from lakes, they're treating it, and then they're distributing it out to residents and businesses. There are some municipalities, particularly in the valley, and their water is drawn from groundwater. So they have larger wells that are pulling water from the ground, and then they're serving those municipalities. And so there's different risks and there's different implications when you have wells versus surface water. And we'll get into some of that here as well. To start with, the provincial, we've talked about provincial statements of interest before. Those are really where, when you look at minimum planning requirements, all planning documents have to have policies to meet the goals that are outlined here. So in the case of drinking water, the specific larger goal is to protect the quality of drinking water within municipal water supply watersheds. So the key piece there that what I was talking about in terms of municipal water is that this is really focused on the municipal water supply, not just homeowners if they have a well that's serving their water needs. There's more detail, but when the provincial kind of statements of interest gets more detailed about how to do that, what they outline are that municipalities should consider, and this is not saying that it's absolutely mandatory, but they need to consider different aspects of land use that can affect the quality of the drinking water supply. So one of those is about uses, looking at the types of uses that are appropriate and ensuring that there aren't uses that would pose a threat to drinking water quality. So there are certain types of uses that involve, chemicals or processes that, if those spilled, then there's a huge risk to a whole municipal water supply. Those are the types of things that are considered when you're looking at uses. You'd probably be familiar, there's a few signs along the 103 talking about, you're in a protected watershed area. If there's an emergency, call this number. If you could imagine, if a fuel truck spilled in one of those areas, that fuel would potentially end up in the lake and could contaminate the water supply for those watersheds. That's why you see those little signs along the highway. And truly, if there is some kind of incident involving hazardous materials or things like that in those areas, it is a much bigger problem, perhaps, if that was allowed to get into the water system. So that's the types of uses that you're trying to reduce risk. This is what this is all focused on. The next piece there is trying to look at where there are existing uses and structures and things like that, balancing how municipalities are allowing the possible expansion of those, and with that kind of risk mitigation idea in mind. The next one, looking at the number and size of lots. So, when you create very hard surfaces where there is a lot of runoff, when you have a lot of density of different uses, whether that's homes or other things, that again increases that risk and can impact water quality. There's a lot of correlation between how close things are to the actual edge of the water in terms of the effect on the water quality. And so that's whether we're talking about drinking water supplies or other lakes or watersheds or rivers in our municipality, the water quality is impacted negatively the closer the development and things are happening to the edge. So another piece that you'll often see in typically all planning documents around protection of water is separating distances from new development and the water itself. A lot of times that also involves vegetative buffers. That also is basically creating a better level of filtering for runoff, as well as water not necessarily running right into the water. If there's stormwater runoff, it can be absorbed more easily by more heavily vegetated areas. The last one here is about, as I was mentioning, kind of the runoff, erosion, sedimentation. Those are things that can occur when you have high levels of development and very little in terms of vegetation that are happening around water areas. So often when you think of a construction site and you'll see those silt barriers that are often put up when they're dealing with slopes and things like that. Sometimes they'll have straw bales that are staked. The whole idea with those is we're limiting the amount of silt and runoff that's coming from that site and is running into various areas. So that's just a larger version of that. So as I mentioned, what we're dealing with in the District of Lunenburg are three primary watershed areas. by far the largest area and the most complex in terms of land use are what are called Heb, Melipsegid, and Menimkeek lakes. So those three areas comprise the watershed that supplies the town of Bridgewater, as well as this area here in Cookville. So those are much, much bigger watersheds with far more development in them as well, in comparison to the other watersheds. So the other ones, Dares Lake, that provides the drinking water supply for the town of Lunenburg, and Oakland Lake provides the water supply for the town of Mahone Bay. Those protected areas were established in the 1960s and 70s, in the case of Lunenburg, to establish Environment Act regulations that pertain to those areas. And so the other thing that you'll see on this graphic is, in the case of Heb, Melipsegid, and Menimkeek, a purple area, and then there's also a green area. You've got Dares Lake where there's a blue, and then there's also a green. That green represents the true natural watershed boundary for those lakes. Oakland, the Environment Act regulations match up with the topography and with the watershed itself. But in the case of the other two areas, the Environment Act designation did not actually cover the full extent of the natural watershed. And they were limited by technology at that time, and so they thought they were encompassing the natural watershed boundary at the time that those were established. What we now know through better technology such as LiDAR, which gives us a very detailed understanding of the topography of different areas and where the slopes basically run the other direction. We now know that the watersheds that feed into basically the town of Bridgewater supply and the town of Lunenburg supply are larger than what the Environment Act protects. So it introduced another kind of level of complexity and need to address, I guess, because when we look back at what the province outlined as, here's some key pieces that you should consider, one being reflecting the natural watershed boundary. So how do we treat the natural watershed boundary when you've got a provincial regulations that don't actually mesh with that? So there's some challenges, I think, with that. Not all of that responsibility lies with the municipality. There's overlying, obviously, levels of jurisdiction here. And when you look at what municipalities' role is, it's around land use. Now, the water commissions, or the utilities that are doing the treatment of the water, they're responsible for the Environment Act piece. So it's a lot easier when you can imagine that one municipality has a water source, like Chester, their water source is within their jurisdiction, they have the complete control over it, or Queens. In our case, we've got one municipality who has a jurisdiction for land use, and then we have another municipality which actually uses most of that water, and they're responsible for regulating the activities that are required under the Environment Act. So there is a requirement to be working collaboratively with the towns because they don't have the control over land use, and of course on the flip side, the District of Lunenburg doesn't have the control over the Environment Act regulations. In most cases, except for places like Cookville, we're not the consumers of the water either, but we certainly have an important role in working with them.
Reid, just before you go on, I think Councillor Oikel had a question on this slide.
Absolutely.
Yes, just regarding that, I noticed that you didn't have Hebville, and I know a portion of Hebville is also serviced by the Malinke Lakes watershed area.
Thank you for clarifying that. I would also, on that point out that there are some little pockets that have zoning. So as some of our secondary plan areas, the Hebville zoning portion does cover what we can see is a light gray. That's showing us the secondary planning area that does cover some level of protection in that watershed. The same thing with the Oakland Lake area, and the Oakland secondary planning area does have some land use control in a portion. as well as I think just the tip of the blockhouse touches on some of the watersheds. So we've got a few little pieces of our watersheds that have some zoning in place. None of them have full protection through our existing secondary planning areas. Sure, yeah.
So just if we're talking about Hebville, in the zoning, the existing zoning that we have, the setback is currently 14 meters away from the water, which is way below the minimum, I guess, recommendation from the province. So the minimum requirement is 30 meters, and what we already have in the existing zone over there is around 14. So we're not really meeting the minimum recommended requirement.
And our CEO just has a question or comment.
Just want to make sure I understood this correctly. The for the Hebbs Lake watershed area in the purple, that is done under the Department of Environment, and it's enforced by the Public Service Commission?
That's correct, yeah.
And that purple line was put in place in 1964?
Correct.
We have better technology now that allows us to outline the green area as a
Yes.
natural watershed?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea why the province just wouldn't have expanded its protection under the Environment Act and allowed the Public Service Commission to regulate that whole area?
No, I guess the short answer is no. But I think with a lot of these things, Jeff may have a better answer. What I'll just add before you jump in, Jeff, is that we did have discussions with the town of Lunenburg, who have outlined a desire to look at expanding that area to encompass the full extent of it. But my understanding, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's at the request of the utility.
Yeah, so having been here for a number of years, served on each of the watershed committees over the years. So yes, so the Public Service Commission can would have the ability to update their regulations to go to the entire natural watershed area. Similar to Oakland. So back in the early 2000s, Oakland had somebody go out with a GPS and actually walk their watershed, and they made adjustments at the time to match their protected water area with the natural drainage. Dares Lake, again, would have the ability to do that as well, but until recently, until we had LiDAR information, the data just wasn't there. But yes, so to answer your question, yes, they could amend their regulations and ask to have those enforced. But as Reid mentioned, what environment does and what the municipality can do through land use planning is there are different controls.
Please continue with your presentation, Reid.
Thank you. So as part of the work that we've conducted on all of the different topic areas, we've looked at different jurisdictions around the province. This is just a few examples. This is not touching on all of them. But what you'll see in most rural municipalities is a protected watershed kind of zone, restrictions on, in some cases, all development, particularly when you have really remote locations for certain, water supplies. As you can imagine, it's much easier to place a very high level of restriction when there's no development nearby. Things like limiting general development in the way of, subdivisions, commercial uses, agricultural uses in the sense that, only in the sense that the land use can control that, as well as kind of, in some cases, allowing a little bit of, continuation if there's existing homes or small-scale residential development. But, making sure that things like the water, water works, if there's different public works facilities that, that these areas may require, to make sure that those are permitted and continue doing what they need to do, as well as things like requiring erosion mitigation plans or stormwater management plans when there's certain types of development allowed, to make sure that you're avoiding as much runoff as possible when you're doing any kind of new development. So that's just a bit of a high-level kind of overview of a few types of areas. So this is, I think, hitting on what we talked about already, but those different roles that are played between the utility and the so the Public Service Commission or the municipalities in terms of Mahone Bay and Lunenburg, and what the different roles are. As I said, if we were one municipality, or if we're like some other municipalities where they consume the water, they treat it, and they also do land use, they would be doing all of this within one organization. In this case, our role as a municipality is through the MGA and the requirements of Statement of Provincial Interest to look at land use and ensure that land use regulations are protecting the water supply. The water utilities, on the other hand, they have certain enforcement and regulation controls when it comes to things like activities. So each municipality, through their utilities, have different regulations that apply to their watershed. They have different controls as well. So it's quite specific to each area, but it largely focuses on things like, you know, I'm just going to look at something here. Storing petroleum products, you know, pest control products. You know, if you're looking at replacing something like an oil tank, what's the requirements of that? Agricultural operations, things like fishing and boating, forestry operations. Typically, those are typically things that municipalities through land use cannot control. So that control is enabled through these regulations that the utilities are empowered to do. But then there is that need to be kind of complementing that with the District of Lunenburg's land use controls. So the idea is that it should be complementary and it should work well together in terms of those different regulations coming together. In terms of what type of engagement has been done on this so far, this is one of those quite specific topics. So there has been actually some fair amount of discussion on this already. We did present and discuss this with council at least one time over the past couple of years, outlining a very similar kinds of information. And then we've also had some discussions with all of the stakeholders. Ella currently sits on those watershed committees as a representative, so there is that important kind of dialogue and communication happening between the towns and the District of Lunenburg, and as well as getting feedback from those different from the different towns on proposed regulations and ideas around what these would need to look like. There was also the What We Heard report from 2020-21. There were some priorities that were outlined from the public around you know, protecting lands and watersheds and things like that. Ella has also had some dialogue with the province, has a watershed planner whose role it is to work with municipalities to establish those protected areas. They did provide some input on the first draft, and have always been kind of supporting making sure that there's a lot of collaboration happening between the water utilities and the district when looking at new regulations because there is so much of that crossover. It's a bit unique compared to some of the other topic areas. So this section just gets into a bit more of kind of outlining what are those different tools and different approaches that can be used to kind of meet the objectives of protecting the water supply. So we've talked about one of those as being using the natural watershed boundary as a guideline for, looking at different levels of protection, because we know that really is the area that all drains into basically the water supply. Erosion control is there are ways to look at best practices when there are different types of development activity occurring, and ensuring that best practices are used to ensure there's less runoff going into the water. Buffers and setbacks, as I mentioned, vegetated buffers are important. This is all about ensuring that fewer or less runoff gets from wherever we are inland into the water. And so all of these kind of help to address that.
And just, I'll get you to pause there for a second, Reid. Councillor Brooks, do you have a question on the particular slide? Okay, sorry.
Thank you. It's around, just if you go back to the previous slide, on what we heard report, and it says prioritizing sustainable forestry practices. So preparing for today, I started to look up what are the requirements, and forestry has specific ones, agriculture under the best practices for environmental farm plans has different ones, and then there are others. And it's not consistent. There's quite a variation. You're using here 30 to 50 meters, but under prioritizing sustainable forestry practices, what beyond those buffers, because it's already stipulated, I think, within the Forestry Act, what those buffers should be. So can you just clarify what that means?
Yeah, and I think that really, it probably speaks more to what's in the Environment Act regulations, because that's where they actually get into regulating some of the forestry activities. So each of the watersheds has regulations that can control things like forestry. And you're right that the Forestry Act does dictate, I believe it's 30 setback from watercourses as a buffer. But it was just to recognize, I think, that there is, in terms of the public's understanding of the issue, they're wanting to see that there is a relationship between sustainable forestry practices, I think, and the protection of watersheds. Not that the land use component has a strong kind of role to play in that. In fact, I think it's covered largely, basically, within the Environment Act regulations and the Forestry Act as well. It was just to outline that the public, I think, is of that view, and thinking about how do we protect watersheds, that there is that connection between them.
I wonder about that, because when you think about the natural watershed for the Hebb Lake, like there's forestry, but there's a lot of agriculture, large scale poultry operations and small scale operations in there as well. And it's interesting that it's forestry that came up. So this was public engagement that identified this?
It was, and I think there's some things here that I think we would want to take a grain of salt with that initial engagement. One was that it didn't really drill into a lot of specific topic areas in terms of asking people the question, what do you think you need to do to address this issue? What do you think you need to do of these certain tools? It didn't get into that level of detail, and it also, I think, and we know, a lot of people are of the view as well that it's been several years as well since that was done. So I wouldn't put a ton of weight on the information that we've gotten from that to say it was comprehensive to speak to every single issue that we're looking at here either.
I'll just add to your previous question, Mayor. So under the Forestry Act or the Forest Act, there is two different sets of setbacks that they are listed under that act. So for regular areas that are outside the watershed boundary, they're recommending a 20-meter, they're mandating a 20-meter setback. Whereas in a watershed zone or watershed areas, they're recommending or requiring a 50-meter setback, which a 50-meter setback helps to attenuate 80% of all contaminants, and that's a really good number of setbacks. So in a way of talking about sustainable forestry or making sure that the way your forestry activities are happening in terms of sustainability is making sure that the water is not being impacted as well. So that's just answering your first question.
Councillor Smith, do you have a question directing this slide?
Yeah, this slide. I know it's kind of premature, but we have received a lot of feedback and we've done a lot of engagement already on draft one. Have we had any feedback specifically on the watershed zones?
No, I mean, I can't be 100% confident because I haven't looked at all of the feedback that we get. I would say not to my knowledge. There might be just a few pieces there that people have submitted. And not to say that there aren't more. And on that note, where the Hebbville engagement is tomorrow night, which really is, going to allow folks from that area to come out as well.
Councillor Oikel?
When I was reading in the first draft, regarding the first draft, around lakes, because I don't live on a lake, I didn't really know what would be appropriate for setbacks. So I went and visited in my area, which is the third district area, 3 different lakes that were there in specific different areas. I went to Fancy's Lake, I went to Frederick Lake area, and then I went, and I don't know what the name of the lake is, I went farther out. And I talked to residents who were living on the lake. And they all, when I mentioned the 30, which is in the draft, they thought that was very reasonable. Their main concern was erosion, and they didn't feel that the setback stopped erosion because they felt the ice on their lakes was what was causing the erosion rather than runoff was causing erosions, but they felt that the 30 meters was very reasonable to them. So I just want to mention that.
Maybe if I can just clarify something as well. With this particular presentation, we really wanted to focus on the drinking water supplies because there is a level of complexity here that I think it's worth having its own discussion. Water setbacks and lakeside zoning are very related because it's a lot of the same rationale behind things like setbacks and buffers. But we didn't kind of get into those other lakes because there is, the statement of interest and there's other requirements that really focus on the drinking water supply. I think to your point, like the rationale for setbacks and things like that is the same when you're looking at maintaining lake water quality. But in this case, what our recommendations would be and what the province is requiring is about the lakes specific to the drinking water supply for the towns, basically.
Mayor McLean-Weil?
Yeah, the complexity of this, particularly around Hebbs Lake, because I think to the point some councillors have made about comment, is that many people would not realize that they are in the watershed area because it is so extensive. And I think that's going to be really, I think when people start to realize, oh, I'm in that area, I did not know that, this is going to raise, then I think people's awareness will be increased.
Yes, thank you very much. And absolutely, I think there's a lot more engagement to come. And I think there are several issues, whether they're in the draft or just that need to be discussed as a part of this, that people just haven't had an opportunity there's been a few topics that I think have dominated conversation, but there is so much more in those documents.
Sorry, just to follow up then, tonight for the public engagement, will you have maps that show this area?
So tomorrow night is the,
Tomorrow night.
yeah, just to clarify.
Sorry.
Hopefully we're sweating here.
ahead of
Yeah, no, yeah, she doesn't have a babysitter, yeah. Our approach so far has not been to have maps, and the rationale for that is we don't want to give the impression that draft one is out there, and we want people to say, this is what council wants to get feedback on, given the direction that was provided previously. I think that what we do, and I've mentioned this to a few people, is once draft number 2 is done, and I think that's a document that we intend to say, this is really something council would like your input on this, and that's where we want to start going into communities and with the maps and the zones and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, we do have copies on hand too for, if people say, look, I really want to look at what's in that draft. And we absolutely can pull those out. But I think it's just a bit of a balancing act about, we want to share the information, but we don't want it to kind of people to get an assumption that this is something that's proceeding or go against the direction, I guess, that council provided. Okay, so there was just the two, so we touched on the different tools and approaches. There's another kind of whole page here, land use regulations. In an ideal scenario, I think in an ideal world, all of the water sources for all of the municipalities would be in a completely undeveloped area, and you could completely limit any new development and not have any possible contaminants or anything like that entering the water. And there are some municipalities, I've done some work in Guysborough, their municipal water supply, I think it's surrounded by Crown land. It's completely isolated. It's great for them. Not everyone has that advantage. Yep. And so, that's where you see a bit of more of a balance you're trying to seek with the land use control. The non-conforming uses piece is, so those are those developments, in our case, largely residential, people that live in these areas. But of course, in terms of the Hemlipsig and Minimkeek, especially in that wider watershed, there are a variety of mixed land use mixes. There's the agriculture and commercial and things like that as well. But the closer you get to the water kind of intake and things like that, the more you need to be sure that things are appropriate. So looking at, when there is new development that you are going to allow, or maybe someone's changing something that's there, making sure that that's done with the water kind of protection as kind of front of mind. The last one here is around multi-zoning, and so that's what the rationale was behind the first draft, was not applying the same brush to every watershed, and also looking at the protected areas versus the newer kind of where we now know the natural watershed boundaries are. So looking at a bit of a tiered approach there. That's similar as well to some of where you see some other best practices with water protection. You want to have the most strict regulations the closer you are to where the water intake is, and then loosen that as you get further and further away. And then also tailor that to how big the watershed is and what type of development and need is there within each community. The watershed size does, kind of lessen, I guess, the intensity of the risk. The smaller you have in terms of a water supply and risk, the easier it is to contaminate it, basically. So there's a recognition of some of the different sizes in the way to approach that through land use control. So what I'm going to get into now is just a bit more of an idea of what we're looking at in terms of our watersheds, and I will outline what the first draft contained to show you an example of an approach that can be used to do land use. So here we have the Hemlipsig and Minimkeek lakes. So the purple line is that's the Environment Act protection area. And then up above that is the green, and that's showing us where the natural boundary is, in fact. And so on the different color coding, within all of these, there's a light green, a light pink, not green at all. It's a light pink color. That's showing us the government-owned properties. That's a very important distinction to make, because many of the ones, particularly closer to the lakes, are owned by the Public Service Commission. And that's what should be the case. And so that's what they are continuing to work towards, is if they can have the ownership and control of those, then they can leave them in a natural state and ensure that there's not any greater risk to the water supply. So they're in a process of always looking at acquiring new properties. Obviously, that there's quite a cost that comes with that, but it also gives you a sense of where do we need to be concerned about on these watersheds. And so we're looking at the white parcels within the within the Environment Act kind of area, the closer area, and then there are different types of land uses on the other colors. So we've got things like agriculture. I don't believe that there's really any institutional, a couple little pieces of, little tiny piece of commercial. But I think probably when we look at the most common would be residential. So that's the kind of dark pink or purple color. That's showing us properties that are used for residential. In terms of, what are some of the statistics here? Just over 400 dwellings, just over 1,400 properties. So a very large area. But once you start to kind of break it down and look at where things are located, fortunately, when the closest areas in the lake shores themselves have a lot of government-owned land already, which is good because that kind of ensures that control is there. But there are a number of areas that are developed already, primarily with residential uses. And so that does pose a challenge from the regulation side of what do you want to continue to allow, and what happens with what exists there now, especially when you go further north into just the green. There's quite a bit more activity in terms of land use, and so it goes as far as excavation businesses and car repair and things like that. So that if those were very close to the water intake, I think it would be a higher level of concern. But recognizing, I think one of those last points was the larger the watershed, the more kind of dispersed development that can probably be handled in a safe way, because if something spills or there's an issue, it takes longer for it to get to the water intake, and it also gets kind of diluted by this just sheer size of the lakes and the landscape itself. So there's a balance that can be looked at here, and that's I think why when we looked at this watershed, we came up with a separate recommendation for this area because of the amount of development that is there now.
Councillor Smith.
Yeah, just wondering if there's any class 4 soil in that area?
I think we would probably be looking at class 3 in terms of if
Or
it were
class 3 or
agricultural
4.
potential. I don't know if any do you know? There might be some.
There might be some, but more in the natural boundary outside of the protected water area, like where the pink area, I would say probably no. But as you go upward towards New Germany area, that's where you have more class 3 classification in terms of soil fertility. So I would say if you go upward, that's where you probably will see it. And there's also some agricultural practices there in the dark green.
On that slide, Reid, any properties that are white are vacant lots? that are privately owned? Because if they were government-owned, they're the pink, correct?
So this, just to clarify, this map was done in 2022, 23. So things might have changed since then. But yeah, everything you see in white it doesn't have dwellings on. It have other structures, but not a residential dwelling.
So this is a bit of an overview of the approach that we included in the first draft. And that was to create a zone that was the highest level of protection or restriction that would be applied to the government-owned properties within the blue. So that's within the already protected provincial regulation area. And then a second, a lesser restrictive zone that would be applied to the privately owned properties within that area. And then third to that, an overlay applied to the upper areas to kind of fulfill the full watershed boundary, which would, an overlay basically applies it can apply different types of requirements over top of another zone. And the reason for that is in that upper area, we would likely see perhaps one or maybe more than one rural type of zone. And so without having an overlay, you have to create a separate zone even again. So it's a more simplified approach if you have just a couple of different requirements that you want to apply, where you might have different types of zones like rural, or maybe that in the case it might be agricultural potential, or if you had a hamlet, or if you had a water or a lakeside zone. The idea is that just could apply a level of protection that has the same requirements that apply no matter what the zone. But in terms of what what you could apply to publicly owned lands in this area, basically very limited types of new development permitted. But the idea is that largely this is public land anyway, and there's very little development that would be occurring here, particularly with properties that are owned by the Public Service Commission. Their intent is the same as our intent in terms of protecting the water supply. So in some ways, less, it almost matters less kind of how restrictive this would be, because they've got that ownership is already in public hands. But in any case, controlling development through, limiting the expansion of uses, restricting uses just so that you have, water treatment facilities only, basically, conservation uses, significant setback requirements where you're doing something other than water utilities, and controlling things like stormwater management and runoff and things like that. So that's an idea of what could be on the public lands portion of this area. This kind of zone 2 is kind of looking at the areas, the privately owned parcels within that blue area.
And just before we go on to zone 2, can we go back one slide? Councillor Oikel had a question on this slide.
Yeah, thank you. So are the requirements that you're suggesting any different than what the Public Service Commission already applies to their properties? Is it more strict?
Yes.
Is stricter than
No,
what they
it's just
already apply?
different. Yeah, it's just different because the water utility can't control some of the things that.
Okay.
So they don't have the ability under their regulations to look at land use or control subdivisions or have a special, for example, if you wanted to allow a certain type of development through a DA, which is, among the higher level of control, they don't have oversight over land use, so they just don't have the ability to do that.
Supplemental.
So-
Within the Hebville planning area, their secondary planning, do they have any regulations within that secondary planning for public lands that are owned by the watershed? Like that are similar to yours, or any at all?
So the Hebville regulations, and Jeff can add if I'm not, if I haven't interpreted well enough, but there's a setback number that applies to all areas along a water body. Whether if it's a land owned by the water utility or whether it's owned by a property owner, they don't have different. No. Just to add to that, the reason why they are purchasing these lands is because they cannot apply land use regulations. So by owning these pieces of land, they, in a way, they are already applying what we are recommending, except from the wind energy. So they are only having water utility use. So in a way, they're trying to keep that lands in their natural state, ensuring less contamination is entering the water bodies in this case.
So this is this zone 2, which the concept could be applied to privately owned parcels within the blue, is the one unique zone. So when we look at the other lakes, this zone here, this zone 2, you won't see that in those. And the reason for that is we wanted to come up with kind of an in-between that fit the larger scale that we're talking about here, in terms of there is the ability to allow more development in this watershed due to its size, and also, probably more importantly, the fact that it already has quite a bit of development in it. And so it's that question about how do you, particularly people with vacant lots who do intend to build on them, how do you reflect those? And, one approach could be, you say you take that zone 1 and apply it everywhere. But what that would basically prohibit any new development on even the vacant lots that are privately owned for folks that may want to build. So what this does is try to strike a balance by permitting very limited development on those existing lots. So people who may want to expand something, creating an approval process for that to make sure it's done appropriately, and allowing very limited residential only on the lots that haven't been built on yet, but also limiting, lot creation, limiting new roads, requiring larger lot sizes as well. All of those are kind of fit that best practices that the province is looking for, because they recognize that those are the best ways to protect, water quality. So it's trying to strike that balance, but the focus really isn't saying only very limited development in this area, residential only, and very limited in terms of the ability to do subdivisions and not doing new roads and things like that. So for those people who would want to build, a fairly significant setback from the water and a buffer, and then requirements when they would build around stormwater management as well. An important piece around the setback requirement is these lakes are not intended and not permitted to have lots of boats and boating and use. So they're really not suited for that kind of lakefront development that you think of on most types of lakes, where there's a real focus on the lake, because the Environment Act does actually already prohibit things like boating and a lot of activities on the water. So for people that live in these areas, the intention is that there's a high level of kind of focus on making the water quality as good as it can be, in abiding by the restrictions that are there in terms of activities anyway.
Councillor Oikel.
Thank you. So in this here particular area for the Watershed Protection Zone 2, I'd like to know, and I think it would be important for our council to know, how many lots would be affected by these requirements for the setbacks. But I'd also like to know if the Department of Environment are these higher than what the Department of Environment already is applying to the residents that live there? Or is it, what is their setbacks that they're requiring?
Right. Yeah, and we've got all of those statistics, and yeah, we can absolutely break that down, kind of, so we can kind of look at basically with the number of dwellings that are there now, and then the number of vacant lots, I think is probably more of the question, and where are those and how many of them are there and things like that. We probably also want to be looking at, are there lots that can't meet that setback as well, when we're looking at that, so we can certainly look at all of those pieces. In terms of, restrictions, I think again, their regulations just can't get into land use. They don't regulate, whether residential use is permitted or whether new lots are created or what the setbacks are. So that doesn't exist in theirs. And I think that's starting to, hopefully is illustrating kind of why, they have their certain role that they play, but there's a gap on the other hand where I think as Ella has illustrated, they're trying to buy up properties because there isn't another control there. With that land use can help address that gap where there is a need to have control over types of uses. Should new roads be built? Should new subdivisions be allowed? How big should the lots be?
So the Department of Environment, provincially or federally, doesn't regulate anything within watersheds? Is that what you're saying? They don't have regulations?
Not land use regulations. So I
Not
can give you an
land,
example.
okay.
I've got the plan in front of me, and we can circulate these out as well. But some of the things that they do restrict in that area, you cannot swim, bathe, or wash in Heb Lake. You can't put or a sewage disposal system needs to be, you need to notify the PSC before you do that. Agriculture operations, manure storage needs to be at least 30 meters. Agriculture operations needs to be at least 20 meters. You can't put, pesticides on things unless you notify the Public Service Commission. So it's more about those types of things that you would think of as activities. Like, we can't control whether somebody swims or boats on Heb Lake, but they can. So like they're kind of in a box that they're restricted to, and then the same thing goes for us as well. Okay. The idea with the overlay, green overlay area is to say that there would be an underlying zone in a lot of areas. There would be some sort of rural zone likely, and in that would outline what the types of uses are, lot size, things like that would be in accordance with what that underlying zone has. But the overlay, in this case, the suggestion that we looked at was around a livestock setback. And that's coming from an existing requirement that we see in the Oakland area plan, which is significant, 100 meters, but from the water courses in that overlay area. That's really the only difference from what requirements would already be in place. In the case of draft one, there's a water setback of 30 and a vegetative buffer of 15 that would not just apply here, but apply everywhere. So if that were different, then you might say, maybe that needs to be in this overlay as well. So things kind of have to work together. If you change one thing over here, do you need to change it in terms of what the overlay looks like? So that was the approach there. Not to introduce, the same approach as within the zone 2, recognizing that there's significantly more development, and it's also further from the water intake itself. So there would be, a lesser impact, I think, on the water quality as you move further out. So that's kind of thinking behind treating that overlay differently. Now, having said that, if the regulations were to change at the provincial level to better reflect the overall kind of full extent of the watershed, I think that would be where you might want to revisit in perhaps, you know, adjust the regulations to be more in line with where the province has drawn their lines. But this is kind of the approach that we took with that first draft.
Councillor Smith has a question, and then Mayor McLean-Weil.
Can you just define the livestock setback, and what are we talking about in terms of livestock? Is this like intensive agriculture, or is it, we're not talking about backyard?
It's fenced areas is what it was, is more the grazing areas, is what the intention with that was. And that was the same regulation that's already in this Oakland area secondary plan, was to say, you know, if there's a grazing area, that it would be set back 100 meters from a water course in that area. Now, and then, of course, new fenced areas, things that are there, always are grandfathered going forward.
Yeah, my question is around, similar to what Councillor Smith has raised, because I know this will be the question: how are you going to send a bylaw officer out to check these things? Our ability to actually enforce it will come into question as we move through this process, as it already has. So I just raised that, and also the requirements. Clearly, this is different than the environmental farm plans. The numbers are significantly higher than what the environmental farm plans require. So that's going to, not that you don't already recognize that there will be some issues raised by residents around that. The thing will be that in this area, you know, I know this area quite well, and there aren't large livestock holdings there. The idea that we would have intensive beef operations, that doesn't exist in Lunenburg County. Probably the largest one would be in the northern, much further north, and those are grazed animals, which is much more common practice here than having animals that are in a small feedlot. Like we're not a feedlot operation here in agriculture. So the grazing is extensive, and I guess I'm just making the comment that even the numbers of livestock in this area are really, from a grazing point of view, would be very small, like probably less than 20. I mean, I don't know. I'm just going by what I know of the area, that the number of head of animals in any given operation are small. So again, the risks are very small when you move to this watershed protected overlay area. There are lots of animals, but the numbers are really small. So again, I'm just, not that you're not prepared for what residents may bring up, but these are the things that, you know, will really kind of grate on people a bit.
I have a question on the water body setback read. Looking at two of the lakes that would be under the A and the F on the draft, there's Louis Lake and there's Frederick Lake, Freddie Lake, some call it Frederick. You would have some properties that border the lake and have a road on the other side and don't have a large width. By having the 30-meter water body setback, this could potentially prohibit development on these lots. Is that correct?
Yep, under that approach, yeah, that would be, and I think that's a very similar situation to the coastal protection regulations. We're not trying to do the same thing with those different setbacks necessarily, but in terms of looking at what affected properties might look like, yeah, there's an implication potentially for people who have very narrow or shallow, I should say, lots. Yep.
Councillor Oigel.
Yeah, mine is regarding the livestock setback. When you took this from the Oakland, and I'm wondering if at the time, how many livestock grazing areas that they had in Oakland, and how many potential ones were for the future that they would feel that 100 meters needed to be put in. Because I'm just kind of wondering, like, did they just say, oh, because we don't have any, so let's stick in 100? You know, like, I wonder what their reasoning behind it was. It is a lot. It is a lot
It's
for the
water
amount of
course as
animals,
well.
as the mayor has mentioned, that we have in our area.
So I'm assuming they base it on Nova Scotia Environmental Farm Plan, which talks about there's different types of setbacks for different types of uses, but for manure storage, for example, 100 meter is a common standard. For wells, water courses, so if we're thinking about a watershed area, that's a standard that is going under the minimum separation distances for agricultural activities. So I'm assuming that's what they base it on. So if there's grazing, but that's one of the standards, but maybe Jeff can add into what was the rationale for Oakland, because no Reed or I were here when that plan was formed.
I have to admit, it's been some time since the Oakland one, so we worked on that. I had to go back through the file to look to see, you know, what the rationale was at the time. But I can say, like, when we look at the Oakland map, the protected water area is much smaller, and it's really only the back of some of the properties, which I believe that at the time there may have been some grazing of farm animals, and at the time they wanted to put something in place and felt it important that that setback needs to be fenced to keep the animals from, you know, going into the watercourse itself.
Follow-up? So basically, because theirs was smaller, they wanted a farther one. So we're actually talking farther out than what than what they're talking about. I think we need to keep that in mind as well when we're putting these setbacks. And I totally agree, like, manure piles should not be close to a watercourse, right? But just grazing animals, you know, so we have to consider those things.
And under the Environment Act activities, grazing or or keeping of livestock needs to meet the 30-meter setback already under the Environment Act within these lakes.
Okay, so that's,
And just, the mayor has,
Yeah, so I'm going to maybe voice my opinion around some of this, is that I think whatever we can do to be consistent with environmental farm planning and the recommendations that come there, that will be much more acceptable to people, because that planning process has been in place for at least 35 years, if not close to 40 years. So anyone who's in commercial agriculture would know that those requirements are in place. Now, having said that, we have a large number of small-scale agriculture who are not commercial operations. Small-scale agriculture would be for individual food security, pleasure, recreation, because there's a lot of that, people keeping animals, and we've heard loudly from that. But I think from a commercial agriculture point of view, even recognizing with small-scale agriculture the palatability and acceptability of following regulations that already exist within good farm practice, are like, people can accept that, I think, more easily and readily than something that's not necessarily within that purview. Because there was a lot of consultation done on environmental farm planning, and it was difficult, as this is difficult. So some of our people have already been through this. So I think I'm just voicing that as things that we need to be aware of. The other thing with manure storage, you know, when you say manure storage to me, I understand it differently than because, you know, I operated a farm that built, and invested, a lot of money in a manure storage facility that held manure. Whereas a manure pile at the end of a barn, which is common here, clearly we don't want that close to waterways. But manure storage, as it would be known in a commercial setting, is again different than what small-scale agriculture would have. So we have lots of challenges around this, but I think most of what we are going to hear from are small-scale agriculture. And so, again, these are the things I think we need to be very conscious of. And what you'll see in the old-style barns here is, the manure went out at the end through a hole in the back of the barn, and there'd be a pile there that would then be spread, come spring. So it's a very different level of rigor that I think is needed around that, as opposed to what we would see in commercial agriculture.
Okay, and I guess maybe this is timely that we can now kind of look to the Oakland Lake area, and clearly a smaller footprint, but yes, more vulnerable for sure, just given its small area. And we've got the interchange there as well with the 103, which, you're introducing a lot of traffic and people getting on and off the highway, and people have vehicle accidents and things like that. And then the road itself on, I think it's number 3, goes right beside the lake. Now that's not something that is within the municipality's control. So, that is what it is. Really, it's a provincial, highway system for sure. But generally, we've got the land uses here do not include any dwellings. I don't think that's changed that we're aware of since this was mapped in 2023, I believe. There's 87 properties. It's a mix government, public works, forestry, especially on the northern side. There isn't like an easy access point to the highway, so that's largely been undeveloped in terms of structures. So in a good way, at least, that development hasn't occurred without some sort of control yet. And in terms of, so this is providing for the town of Mahone Bay. Now, in terms of the control that's already in place here, what the portion of Oakland Lake on the south side, and there's kind of a peninsula as well, that's already within the Oakland secondary plan area that limits new development. I believe there's not really much, they don't really allow new development in that area. So
just to add, most of these properties do have houses on them, but they're the old land structures where they're very long and narrow. So most of it is cut out, and the areas that is closer to the water, that's where there's prohibition of development happening.
Yeah, like the old Acadian lots, yeah. So a lot of those lots would have split zoning that have the front part where they have the house, but when it gets back to the lake there, it's limited by that zone. What was in the first draft for this area was, because they've got the Environment Act regulations that do cover the whole area, and which Jeff has noted that they did adjust kind of to really pinpoint where those areas were. The approach here was to apply the same kind of higher level of protection zone to the unzoned areas within this, which would, be consistent with the zone 1 that we talked about previously, and the other lakes. Now that would kind of limit new development, basically, and not allow new residential as well in these areas. So that would, introduce new prohibition for people that have privately owned parcels here. Now, some people use some of these properties for forestry uses. And if that's permitted under the Environment Act and the Forestry Act as a resource use, of course, that can continue to occur. It's not something we can control as a municipality. So for those people, they probably wouldn't see much, but if they were thinking about building and developing or maybe putting subdivision or homes, this approach would change that. So it's taking that same zone, kind of the higher level of restriction zone we talked about before, putting it on the unzoned portions here as well. So lastly, we have Dares Lake. This is another one of those ones that there's new information, and we know it's a lot larger, the boundary. And in terms of existing land uses, there are a few homes, 189 properties. It's a mix, government, agriculture, forestry. I believe, I'm guessing, although you would know, the town, in terms of those government-owned portions on the south side, I imagine are owned by the town, their water commission?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, or utility.
Yep. And I don't know if you want to add that, but Dares Lake is quite unique in comparison to the other ones in terms of, in this regard, under the Environment Act, it also regulates land use and not just activities.
Right.
So under the Environment Act for Dares Lake, any new residential use or agricultural use are prohibited. Only existing uses, such as residential or agricultural use, are permitted to stay, but any new development could not happen, and that's under the Environment Act. So in that regard, that's interesting that where the province is also overlapping into land use regulations as well.
Yeah, so I guess in that sense, there's not the level of concern. If we were only looking within the blue area, we don't need to be concerned that there's new residences and agricultural uses occurring there because the Environment Act, for whatever reason, has included those activities. It's not, I don't know if it's entirely clear the history of that particular inclusion in there. That was 1970s. But in any case, they have limited it there. Obviously, that doesn't deal with the larger boundary to the north. I do just want to clarify, it says wetland on those. Please ignore that. It should say watershed protection zone. The intention there is that I was always talking about watershed areas on the map. This is the same approach as the last one, with the areas included in the watershed protection kind of Environment Act piece, to be consistent with the kind of higher level of restriction there, and then the overlay further to the north, kind of consistent with what the larger watershed, what we talked about with the overlay in agriculture as well in that area. I guess the top piece does have that blockhouse kind of overlap in that plan area, but it's quite a small portion. Yeah, and so that just outlines the same information we just talked about with the overlay piece as well. And we did have a couple of conversations with staff in the town of Lunenburg about this approach, and they had indicated an interest in approaching the province about expanding the Environment Act regulations, but obviously that's a whole other piece of work that they need to do. So that really does kind of break down the different lake areas and kind of what some of the thinking is, at least behind the first draft, but more importantly, I think just outlining some of the issues and some of the balance that we have to deal with some of the other regulations that we're dealing with on the Environment Act side, as well as cooperating with the different utilities with each of the towns as well. So we're happy to take questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you for that. And as Councillor Oikel had mentioned, we haven't really had the meetings in the communities where these lakes are, so we might have more engagement to come. But I think it gives us as council members more information to go out and relay those concepts. Is there any questions or comments from council members? Mayor McLean-Weil?
Just to the point that was raised earlier about the map, I just wonder at the HEBS meeting if it's useful to have a map that shows that extended watershed area, because I feel like that's the meeting where there will be the most conversation about watershed, even beyond some of the others, because it's got lots of issues, as you know. But whether that might be a useful, I don't know what you think about that, just because my concern is that people don't know they're in the watershed area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's certainly something we could do. I think we'd want to update. I think what map might be helpful is not to get into this is a zone here and a zone here, but we can just look at land use and identify where those boundaries are, and just so people can see where things are today and what types of uses are already occurring, what types of regulations are already in place. We could certainly print something off for that meeting. Yeah.
Councillor Smith.
That was my point exactly. I just think we need to start opening up the conversation about watersheds, and we can be really clear that the draft 1 regulations are kind of back to the drawing board, but yeah, people need to know where they are and where they are in the conversation. And I don't think that's quite happened yet on some of these things.
Yeah, just to further comment, I think we should not make assumptions about the level of understanding that people have. Obviously, and I think we've all experienced it in our meetings to date, that people have focused on a few key things that really struck with them personally, but putting planning in the bigger picture of why and what is involved in it, it is complex. I mean, you've spent, I don't know how long it took, but like, this is really complicated. And when you add in the complexity of a watershed area to the regular planning process, it adds another layer of complexity. And particularly when people may not even realize that they're in a watershed area, that engenders a whole host of other conversation around what do we need to do, how much do we need to do, and how is it going to affect me, which is ultimately the bottom line question, because people want to know for their particular property how it is impacting on them. And if they're in a watershed area, even, and I'm thinking particularly of that northern area because it's really expansive, it's pretty well developed, as you know, that this is going to be like really, we're going to have a lot of conversation around this when people realize that that they are going to be touched in a different way potentially by what we're doing.
And I think there's always opportunities for specific discussions with communities that we can, just thinking a little bit further down the road, we can have a discussion with kind of targeting the community that lives in the watershed only, and say, like, folks that may live in the Hebbville community, that we're going to hear from a lot of those people, I would think, tomorrow. But to have a focused conversation only about drinking water in that area, that's something we can always do, in terms of a future kind of engagement piece.
Councillor Reinhardt.
Thanks. Could you put up the map of the Heb watershed? I'm just kind of looking at the other watersheds that kind of have that protective buffer all around the lake. And seeing there with the PW1 and the PW2, there is room for some development like along the lake. So is there a concern there if all of those were to be developed? would that put, you know, undue stress on not just the watershed, but the biodiversity, and there's species that are very endangered in that area. So is it okay if all of that were to be developed? Would it put undue stress on that area?
I guess, I think maybe you were also referencing maybe those other lakes that have and this, we're talking about the first draft as well, a possible lakeshore zone. Is that maybe what you're?
Oh, I was just comparing it to like the Dares Lake and, yeah.
I can take a crack at that. I guess that really points out the different approach to this watershed versus the other ones. That's the big one, is the approach that we took with this was to say limited new development could continue to recognize the amount of undeveloped land, but to say it could be done under some very specific criteria, including significant setbacks, significant buffers, no new private roads, no new, for the most part, larger subdivisions. So the type of development I think you would see would be very low impact that could occur under that criteria. The other important piece as well, just given the geographic size that this watershed can handle, and this is feedback also from the province on the appropriateness of, looking at a watershed like this versus Oakland. This watershed could handle higher levels of development safely when you look at an area like Oakland.
And yet, just to add to that, even though it can hold more development than the smaller watersheds, applying those setbacks that we recommend, or the options of setbacks that we proposed, I don't know what the word is, are important in order to make sure that even though there's limited development that will be permitted in that area, to mitigate the contaminants and sedimentation and runoff that carries all that contaminants into the lakes from happening. Because yes, definitely it can hold more development than the other ones, but again, what type of development can it hold? If there's no setbacks, those lakes, even though they're larger in scale, they can still get contaminated, and then it really affects the water quality as well. So there's different types of tools or approaches that you still need to apply, even though they are larger in scale and they can accommodate more uses in comparison to the other ones.
I'm not seeing any other hands from council. I would like to turn it over to the gallery. Did you have any questions or comments that you wanted to bring forward to council? Yes, okay. If you'd like to step forward to the podium and just state your name and the community in which you're from. And you can raise the podium. Yeah, or you're more comfortable to sit there, that's too. Just push the button on the mics because we are recording, and then we can hear you clearly.
Thank you. I'm George Barani. I live in the Milipsaget-Menimkiak Lake watershed. I really appreciate the work that this committee has done on this issue and the approach they're taking, and I like the multi-story approach where you're treating zones and realize that there are going to be different kind of requirements depending on the needs of that zone. The question I kind of have is, we know that within that watershed there is some industrial development occurring at present, and so important that future land use address that. And my understanding is that the Public Service Commission regulates or enforces some of the environmental part, and the municipality looks at the land use. So important as to how to make land use requirements maybe more stringent, and also concerned that whatever is submitted here, provincial government seems to be able to override, as they did with the Public Service Commission request that industrial development not take place. And so I'm wondering, there are additional protections within the Environmental Act. Some things fall under a Class 1 protection, and some things fall under a Class 2 protection. And is this committee able to, within that zone, say, can they also increase the protection to Class 2 environmental protection for all industrial activity, not residential or private property, but at least for the public lands fall under Class 2? And even look at that for private lands, I suspect, in that area. That would then have impact, I suspect, on forestry, mining, future quarry operations, and any other heavy industrial use.
Thank you for the comments. Reid, do you have anything you want to add? This isn't for decision points right now, but we want to hear from you. So everything is being taken note of. But if you'd like to comment, Reid, on that, please feel free to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think you're probably referring to the kind of Environment Act kind of regulations that if at different types of larger industrial uses, they fall under the 1 or 2 in terms of the
Yes.
approvals process. And the bigger the proposal, the more stringent the Environment Act. Yeah. So with that, under the land use regulation piece, you do run up into a limit to what we can control under the Municipal Government Act. Council and the committee, council as a whole, can advocate with the province on different pieces of legislation that may have an impact here, such as the process that was followed with I think it was a quarry in the watershed area. That quarry wouldn't have been something that this land use control really could have had much impact on. We can have a limited impact on structures related to industrial uses, or I should say resource-related uses like that. But it's more about separating uses that you don't want to see conflicting. So as an example, if you have a quarrying operation that has a big rock processing plant, we wouldn't be able to say you can have that plant or not, but you could say it needs to be separated from nearby residential uses, or in the reverse, that those residential uses need to be set back from that to avoid a noise issue, noise and dust and other interruptions. But in terms of the approval of that, the province really kind of does dictate that process from their end, and there isn't that as much direct control within the kind of land use process. But there's certainly an ability to advocate around different legislation that the municipality as a whole absolutely has a control.
Okay, great, thank you. I guess, yeah, as I understand what you're saying, there's not much in terms of further land use policy that would prevent that kind of development. And it's really up to the Department of Environment maybe to address that?
Yeah, I guess, and maybe I can clarify too. If it's a use like resource-related extraction, mining, forestry, quarrying, that entire kind of approval really falls within the province. And most of that does not involve necessarily a lot of development in terms of buildings. I think people would see those as industrial uses in how it impacts the environment. But it's by and large completely controlled at the provincial level. When it comes to other types of what people think of as heavy industry, as an example, like a factory or a plant of some sort, there is that ability for the municipality to control zoning. And I think at the end of the day, anything that you're correct does have to go to the Minister of Municipal Affairs for approval. They do have the ultimate authority to change or alter these documents in the end and what they look like. And they do have the ability to change or alter the control that the municipality has in certain areas. They've done some of that around HRM in terms of planning, taking direct provincial control over that. So the municipalities are always at the, you know, under whatever the province determines is within the jurisdiction to control.
Okay, great. Can this committee ask that Class 2 standards apply to certain zones within the designated watershed? Is it something you can advocate for as a committee or as a municipality?
Advocate for it, absolutely. In terms of what, controlling that through this process, no. But,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, just to provide some clarity, the input is very helpful, but the committee's not making any decisions at this point. So certainly making it clear what you're looking for has been great. And then the council members who will eventually make the decisions can consider that when they get to that point.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Yeah. And if you leave today and think of some other questions, we will be in Headville tomorrow evening at the Fire Hall from 6 to 8, and would encourage you or any members listening to join and take part in that discussion. Okay. Any further comments? Okay. We have already gone through the other items on the agenda, so seeing that there's no further items for discussion, we will call this meeting adjourned.